But to bring you up to date with a story that is the lead story in many US publications today, it's about the relationship right now between the US and Venezuela. The White House defending their Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth, against allegations that in September he instructed the US military to kill everyone on board a suspected Venezuelan drug smuggling vessel. Now, Hegseth reportedly ordered a second airstrike against survivors clinging to wreckage. Some US politicians and former officers say that would constitute a war crime, but the White House insists the strikes were legal.
With respect to the strikes in question on September 2nd, Secretary Hegseth authorized Admiral Bradley to conduct these kinetic strikes. Admiral Bradley worked well within his authority and the law, directing the engagement to ensure the boat was destroyed and the threat to the United States of America was eliminated.
Okay, I need you to stop everything you're doing right now and pay very close attention to what I'm about to tell you, because this is one of the most disturbing and potentially criminal stories to emerge from the Trump administration during this entire second term. And honestly, that's really saying something given absolutely everything else we've been covering on this channel over the past year. Former national security officials, people who have served at the highest levels of the American government under presidents of both political parties, people who have dedicated their entire careers to protecting this country, are breaking their silence to accuse the Trump administration of committing what they believe may constitute war crimes under international law. We're talking about allegations that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth personally ordered American military forces to kill survivors of an initial missile strike on a Venezuelan drug boat, not armed combatants actively posing an immediate threat to American forces or interests. Survivors, people who were struggling in the water after their boat had already been destroyed by the first attack. And according to these explosive reports from major news organizations, Hegseth allegedly gave a verbal order to, and I need to quote this directly because it's so shocking, kill everybody. Those are the exact words being attributed to the Defense Secretary of the United States of America, kill everybody. And now former officials and bipartisan lawmakers are demanding immediate investigations, demanding sworn testimony under oath, and openly using the words war crime and murder to describe what allegedly happened under Hegseth's direct orders. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
We're learning new details about one of those deadly U.S. strikes on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean. Sources tell CNN the U.S. military carried out a follow-up strike on September 2nd after becoming aware of survivors in the water. The sources tell us that prior to the strike, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth had ordered the military to ensure everyone on board was killed. People briefed on the, quote, double tap strike say they're concerned that it could violate the law of armed conflict, which prohibits the execution of an enemy combatant who is taken out of the fight due to injury or surrender. Now, since September, as you're seeing on your screen here, the U.S. military has carried out at least 21 known strikes on suspected drug trafficking boats, killing at least 83 people. Officials have also acknowledged, though, not knowing the identities of everyone on board before they are struck.
Let me walk you through exactly what we know, because this story broke wide open over the last few days, and it's moving extremely fast with new developments emerging almost hourly. On November 30th, 2025, The Washington Post published an absolutely explosive investigative report detailing a military strike that occurred back on September 2nd of this year. According to the detailed reporting based on multiple sources with direct knowledge of the operations, American forces initially struck a Venezuelan boat suspected of carrying drugs as part of the Trump administration's aggressive anti-narcotics campaign in Caribbean waters. That first strike was successful in military terms. It destroyed the vessel and eliminated it as a potential threat. But then, according to multiple sources who spoke to the reporters investigating this story, came a second strike, a deliberate follow-up attack. And the target of that second strike wasn't another armed vessel approaching American forces or a threatening enemy position that needed to be neutralized. The target of that second strike was specifically the survivors from the first attack, people who were floating in the water, people who were wounded and struggling to stay alive, people who pose absolutely no immediate threat to American forces whatsoever, people who, under the established laws of armed conflict that the United States has formally agreed to follow, are supposed to be protected from any further attack once they're incapacitated and no longer capable of fighting. The reports indicate that Hegseth personally gave the verbal order for that devastating second strike, telling American forces to kill everybody on the boats. If this reporting is accurate and multiple sources have now confirmed the essential details, this represents a fundamental and knowing violation of the laws of war that the United States has committed to following for generations through treaty obligations and military regulations. The military regulations, Geneva Conventions, which the United States formally ratified and which are considered binding law for all American military forces anywhere in the world, contain explicit protections for people who are hors de combat, a French legal term meaning out of the fight and no longer participating in hostilities. This category specifically includes wounded combatants who can no longer fight due to their injuries. It includes people who have surrendered and laid down their weapons, and critically for this situation, it explicitly includes survivors of attacks on ships or aircraft who are in the water or otherwise incapacitated and unable to continue fighting. The principle underlying these protections is straightforward and has been recognized for centuries. Once someone is no longer capable of posing a genuine military threat to opposing forces, you cannot lawfully kill them under any circumstances. They become protected persons under international humanitarian law. Deliberately attacking them isn't legitimate warfare conducted according to established rules. It's execution, it's murder. And multiple legal experts who have carefully reviewed what's been reported about these drug boat operations are saying exactly the same thing. If this happened the way it's being described by sources with direct knowledge, it almost certainly constitutes a war crime under established international law. All right, let's really dig into what's happening here, because this story has layers that connect directly to everything else we've been covering about the chaos and lawlessness in the Trump administration throughout this second term. The drug boat strikes themselves, the alleged kill order from Hegseth, the war crime accusations from legal experts, the congressional investigations now ramping up. All of it ties together with the broader pattern of an administration that genuinely believes it can operate without any legal constraints whatsoever, and a defense secretary who has been systematically dismantling the legal oversight mechanisms within the Pentagon that might have prevented something exactly like this from happening in the first place. So let me walk you through the full picture of what we're dealing with, the legal framework that applies, and why former national security officials who have served this country honorably for decades are so deeply alarmed by what's been reported. First, let's understand what the laws of armed conflict actually require and why deliberately killing survivors is treated so seriously under international law that civilized nations have agreed to follow. The Geneva Conventions, which the United States formally ratified decades ago and which are considered absolutely binding law for all American military forces operating anywhere in the world, contain very specific protections for people who are classified as hors de combat under international humanitarian law. This French legal term translates to out of the fight and refers to people who are no longer participating in hostilities for various reasons. This protected category explicitly includes wounded combatants who can no longer fight due to the severity of their injuries. It includes people who have formally surrendered and laid down their weapons, indicating they no longer wish to continue fighting. And critically for understanding this drug boat situation, it explicitly includes survivors of attacks on ships or aircraft who are in the water or otherwise incapacitated and unable to continue participating in hostilities. The fundamental principle underlying all of these protections, straightforward, and has been recognized by civilized nations for centuries of developing the laws of war. Once someone is no longer capable of posing a genuine military threat to opposing forces, once they are out of the fight for whatever reason, you absolutely cannot lawfully kill them under any circumstances. They become protected persons under international humanitarian law. Deliberately attacking them isn't legitimate military action conducted according to established rules of warfare. It's execution without any legal basis, and under international law that the United States has formally agreed to follow, it constitutes a war crime punishable by severe penalties. This fundamental principle exists for very important reasons that go far beyond just abstract morality or legal technicalities. Wars throughout human history have been marked by horrific atrocities when the killing continues indiscriminately after the actual fighting has ended. Massacres of prisoners who had surrendered, systematic execution of survivors who posed no threat, the deliberate slaughter of wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. The laws of armed conflict developed over many centuries specifically to prevent these recurring horrors, to establish clearly that even in the chaos and violence of war, there are absolute limits on what combatants can lawfully do to each other. The United States has been a global leader in developing and enforcing these humanitarian norms throughout the modern era. American military personnel at all levels are trained extensively on the laws of armed conflict as part of their basic education and ongoing professional development. They're taught clearly that following illegal orders is itself a crime under military law, that my commanding officer told me to do it is not a valid legal defense for committing atrocities. And American military lawyers, the judge advocates general we've discussed extensively in previous videos, exist within every branch of the armed forces, specifically to ensure that military operations comply with all applicable legal requirements before those operations are actually executed. Now let's talk specifically about what allegedly happened on September 2nd, 2025, and why the reported events are generating such intense alarm among legal experts and former officials who understand the gravity of what's being described. According to the detailed Washington Post reporting based on multiple sources with direct knowledge of these operations, American forces conducting anti-drug operations in Caribbean waters targeted a Venezuelan boat suspected of carrying illegal narcotics as cargo. The first strike was conducted successfully, and the targeted vessel was destroyed as intended. At that point, under the clearly established laws of armed conflict, any survivors in the water from that destroyed vessel would have been legally entitled to protection from further attack. They were no longer combatants capable of posing a threat. They were no longer participants in any ongoing hostilities. They were simply people struggling to survive in the ocean after their boat was destroyed by military attack. But according to multiple sources who have spoken to reporters investigating this story, a second strike was then deliberately ordered, and the specific target of that second strike was the survivors from the first attack, people floating helplessly in the water. Reports indicate that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth personally gave the verbal order for this follow-up attack, allegedly using the words "kill everybody," not secure the area and monitor for additional threats, not rescue survivors for interrogation about drug trafficking networks. Kill everybody. If this reporting is accurate and is now being confirmed by multiple independent sources, this would represent a direct and knowing violation of the laws of armed conflict by the highest-ranking civilian official in the Department of Defense. It would mean that the Defense Secretary of the United States personally ordered what amounts to the execution of people who were explicitly protected under international humanitarian law, and it would mean that American military personnel carried out that illegal order, potentially making them liable as well for following a command that any trained service member should have recognized as unlawful. Legal experts who have carefully analyzed the reported situation are using extremely strong and unambiguous language to describe what apparently occurred. One prominent international law professor told PBS reporters that if there was a deliberate second strike, specifically targeting survivors who were in the water, it clearly violates the laws of war, regardless of how you legally characterize the underlying conflict. Even if you completely accept the Trump administration's somewhat questionable legal theory that military operations against drug cartels constitute a legitimate armed conflict under international law, the rules protecting hors de combat survivors still absolutely apply in full force. You cannot kill survivors who pose no threat just because they were previously involved in illegal activity. The Geneva Conventions don't contain any exception for drug traffickers or criminals. The laws of war don't become optional or subject to executive waiver because the targets are engaged in criminal activity rather than conventional military operations. Either we follow the established rules that we've agreed to follow, or we don't. And what's being described in these reports sounds very much like we deliberately chose not to follow them. The political reaction across Washington has been explosive and notably bipartisan in ways that distinguish this scandal from many others. Senator Chris Van Hollen's characterization of this as a very possible war crime or plain murder represents the kind of extraordinary language that sitting United States senators simply don't use publicly unless they genuinely believe something deeply wrong and potentially criminal has occurred. Former officials like John Kelly, who served as Trump's own chief of staff during his first term and previously served as Secretary of Homeland Security, expressing what he calls serious concerns about crossing lines, carries enormous weight given his distinguished military career and his direct experience working with Trump. Even some Republican lawmakers who have been extremely reluctant to criticize anything the administration does are reportedly expressing private concerns about what's been reported, understanding that war crimes accusations create political and legal exposure that goes far beyond normal policy, disputes, or partisan controversies. All right, let's break this down into the key points everyone needs to understand about the drug boat survivor strike scandal and why it represents such a profoundly serious crisis for the Trump administration and potentially for everyone involved in these operations. Because this isn't just another political controversy or policy dispute that can be debated and spun by talking heads on cable news. This is a formal accusation of war crimes, of deliberately killing people who pose no threat and were entitled to protection under international law, and it could have consequences that extend far beyond American domestic politics into international legal accountability. Point number 1, the specific allegations against Hegseth describe conduct that would clearly and unambiguously constitute a war crime under established international law that the United States has formally agreed to follow through treaty ratification. This isn't a close legal question or a gray area where reasonable experts might disagree about whether the described conduct was permissible under certain interpretations. Deliberately targeting survivors who are incapacitated and no longer fighting is explicitly and unambiguously prohibited by the Geneva Conventions that bind American forces. The United States military trains all personnel extensively on these rules as part of their basic education. Every commander at every level knows or absolutely should know based on their training that you cannot lawfully order the killing of survivors who are horde to combat. If Hegseth gave the order that's being attributed to him by multiple sources, kill everybody, and that order resulted in deliberate attacks on people floating helplessly in the water who pose no threat whatsoever, that's a war crime under any reasonable interpretation of international humanitarian law, period, full stop. The legal analysis on this point is simply not complicated or subject to legitimate dispute. Point number 2, this devastating scandal exposes the catastrophic real-world consequences of Hegseth's systematic destruction of military legal oversight throughout his tenure as Defense Secretary. We've covered extensively in previous videos how Hegseth has been firing and sidelining military lawyers, the JAGs, whose specific job is to ensure that military operations comply with the laws of armed conflict before those operations are executed. He's called them crude names like jagoffs. He's complained bitterly about roadblocks from what he considers excessive rules of engagement. He systematically pushed them out of the decision-making process where they traditionally played a crucial role. And now we're seeing in the starkest possible terms what happens when those essential legal guardrails are deliberately removed from military operations. An order that should have been flagged immediately as illegal, that should have been stopped by military lawyers before it was ever executed, apparently went forward without meaningful legal review because the people whose job is to prevent exactly this kind of thing from happening have been systematically pushed aside by Hegseth. The drug boat survivor strike may be the most catastrophic and criminal example yet of what inevitably happens when you remove legal oversight from military operations. Hegseth created the institutional conditions that allowed this to happen and then allegedly gave the direct order that made it happen. Point number 3, Trump's own public response to this scandal has created additional legal and political exposure by directly contradicting the reported facts in ways that suggest either deliberate deception or dangerous ignorance about what his administration is doing. When Trump said on air, Force 1, that he believes Hegseth 100% and that he wouldn't have wanted a second strike on survivors, he was either knowingly lying about what actually happened to protect his defense secretary from accountability, or he genuinely doesn't know what orders Hegseth is giving to American military forces. Neither option is remotely acceptable for a commander-in-chief. A president who lies to cover up potential war crimes is directly participating in the cover-up and may share criminal liability. A president who genuinely doesn't know his defense secretary is ordering strikes on survivors is dangerously disconnected from what American military forces are doing in his name. The glaring contradictions between Trump's public statements and the detailed reporting from multiple sources are already becoming a primary focus of congressional investigators who want to establish who knew what and when they knew it. Point number 4. The notable bipartisan alarm from former national security officials signals clearly that this scandal has genuine potential to break through the usual partisan defenses in ways that other controversies simply haven't. When John Kelly, Trump's own former chief of staff and a retired 4-star Marine general, expresses what he calls serious concerns about crossing lines, that's not a Democratic partisan attack that can be dismissed as politically motivated. When multiple former officials with decades of combined experience in national security and military affairs say publicly that this looks like a war crime, that assessment carries significant weight across the political spectrum regardless of party affiliation. There are Republicans who are genuinely uncomfortable with what's being reported, who understand clearly that defending war crimes is simply not a viable political position, regardless of partisan loyalty or desire to support the administration. Now, what happens next with this explosive scandal? In the short term, expect congressional investigations to intensify very rapidly over the coming days and weeks. Both chambers of Congress have clear constitutional authority to conduct oversight of military operations. Lawmakers from both parties are demanding sworn testimony from Hegseth and other officials involved in planning and executing the drug boat operations. They want to see all relevant communications and documents. They want to understand the complete chain of command. They want to know exactly who gave what orders and whether anyone raised legal objections that were overridden or ignored. These investigations will produce testimony under oath and documentary evidence that could either confirm or contradict the current reporting and could create very significant legal exposure for any officials who testify falsely. In the medium term, watch carefully for potential international legal consequences that could affect American officials for years to come. The International Criminal Court has formal jurisdiction over war crimes under international law, and while the United States has historically resisted ICC authority over American citizens, the court can still investigate allegations and potentially issue arrest warrants for individuals accused of serious violations of international humanitarian law. Trump has already imposed sanctions on the ICC in what appears to be an attempt to preempt exactly this kind of international accountability. But those sanctions don't actually eliminate the court's legal authority or prevent it from conducting thorough investigations. American officials involved in potential war crimes could face international legal consequences even if domestic political accountability ultimately fails. In the long term, this scandal has the genuine potential to fundamentally reshape the entire political landscape heading into the crucial 2026 midterm elections. War crimes are not normal political controversies that can be managed through communication strategy. They can't be spun away with clever talking points or deflected through partisan attacks on critics. The mental image of American forces deliberately killing survivors floating helplessly in the water is viscerally disturbing in ways that cut across partisan lines and affect people regardless of their political affiliation. If the reporting is accurate, and if additional evidence continues to emerge confirming what's been described, this becomes the defining scandal of Trump's entire second term. It becomes the thing that historians focus on when they write about this period. It becomes the moral stain that overshadows every policy achievement the administration might claim. And it becomes the issue that Republican candidates in competitive districts absolutely have to answer for when they face voters, because defending the indefensible is simply not a winning political strategy. And here's the crucial connection to absolutely everything else we've been covering about this administration throughout Trump's second term. The DOJ in complete chaos with collapsed prosecutions and mass resignations, the FBI being systematically purged of independent voices, the military lawyers being sidelined and fired for doing their jobs, the court orders being openly defied, the emergency powers being aggressively abused. All of it reflects the exact same fundamental approach: an administration that genuinely believes it can do whatever it wants without any legal constraints or meaningful accountability. The drug boat survivor strike is simply the most extreme and disturbing manifestation of that lawless approach. It's what inevitably happens when an administration truly believes that rules don't apply to them and that they can operate with complete impunity. And if there are ultimately no consequences for allegedly ordering the execution of helpless survivors in the water, then there really are no limits whatsoever on what this administration might do next. All right, that's going to do it for this one. This is obviously an extremely serious and rapidly developing story with implications that extend far beyond normal political coverage. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think about this situation. Should Hegseth face formal criminal investigation for the alleged kill order? Should there be real accountability for potential war crimes committed by American forces? What does it mean for America's standing in the world if we're deliberately killing survivors in clear violation of international law? I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on these critical questions. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story is moving extremely fast and there's going to be a lot more to cover in the coming days and weeks as investigations proceed. Until then, keep paying attention, keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you in the next one.